Good evening and welcome to this evening's lecture. It's a great privilege for us to welcome you here and to have Carlton Eley as our guest speaker. He is the Environmental Protection Agency's leading expert on equitable development and focusing on normalizing practices for environmental justice. His home office is in Washington, D.C., so he came from the other Washington tonight to tell us about what he's been doing. He's actually the first urban planner to be hired by EPA in their Office of Environmental Justice. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology and social work from Elizabeth City State University in North Carolina, and a Master of Science in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Iowa. At EPA, he advances equitable development through outreach and education, partnership development, research, technical support, and national recognition programs. He focuses on social responsibility of planners to expand choice and opportunity for all persons and to address equity of life goals while supporting community parity. Tonight, he will present examples of a successful development to consider social equity and environmental justice, and it's a great privilege and high honor for me to introduce Carlton Eley. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dean Schaufelberger, for the introduction, and good evening to all of you. It's a great crowd. And I just want to state that I want to thank the College of Built Environments for extending the invitation to participate and to share some remarks on this evening. As Dean Schaufelberger has shared, I work for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Environmental Justice. I am the first planner that has been hired by EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. I've worked there for roughly about 5 years. And I manage a portfolio on the topic of equitable development. When you think of community planning, you don't always think about environmental justice. So really my job at the Environmental Protection Agency has been to help change that perception. I believe on this evening there are some students who are here from the Equity Council within the College of Built Environments. And what I want to make sure that I do is that I'm courteous enough to say I want to thank you for your leadership. I salute you for reminding us as practitioners that equity should be a core value in terms of our work. At the Environmental Protection Agency, we define equitable development as an approach to meet the needs of underserved communities through policies and practices that reduce disparities while fostering places that are healthy and vibrant. That is my nerdy definition. I know we live in an era where a premium is placed on clever messaging and being trendy, but I'm old-fashioned, and so I like it when definitions are a bit more precise. And so on this evening, what I want to do is just take about 40 minutes just to have a conversation with you briefly about some of the great work that's actually happening around the country, work that I feel that really should be part of the industry dialogue as it pertains to how do we improve communities. When I spoke with Dean Schaufelberger just a day ago, he was pleased that I was coming to talk about the issue, but he wanted to make sure that I didn't just share it with you in a conceptual manner, but we also focus on solutions. And so this outline is just simply my succinct way of saying that we're going to focus on the concept, but more importantly, we're going to focus on a broad set of solutions that are actually happening around the country. And so my goal and objective is really to make sure that we move from idea to practice within the span of time that I have available. If I could take my remarks and summarize it in one sentence, I would use a quote from Kathryn Prigmore. She's an architect based in Washington, D.C. And she once said that our experience affects our process and manifests itself in the aesthetics. I'm a sociologist, I'm an urban planner, and I'm a civil servant. So as a sociologist, I often strive to give voice to the unspoken. As an urban planner, I try to speak up for people who may not have a voice in the planning process, and I encourage the alteration of policies that may not meet their needs. And as a civil servant, I believe public service is a public trust. These are my values. I didn't have the benefit of a roadmap when I started down this path roughly about 13 years ago. And so I had to use my own personal values as a guide while focusing on this particular subject. One of the things that I do want to acknowledge and share with you on this evening is really the fact that in 1994, I spent the summer in Seattle, Washington. I was interning with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, working in the environmental justice program at that time. And it wasn't until years later, after that internship, that I realized that the experience of being here in Seattle really left an impression on me in terms of my perspectives as a planner. And what Seattle taught me in the process of working on some very important issues in terms of how do we correct the problems of communities that may be disproportionately burdened by pollution, it taught me the fact that our sensitivities to environmental justice, which start with community involvement and community cleanup, also need to carry through to community recovery and redevelopment. So after that internship, approximately two years later, I actually enrolled in graduate school at the University of Iowa to pursue my degree in urban planning. And in 1998, I graduated. Actually, it was on May 15, 1998, so just yesterday, 20 years ago. And the interesting thing about that experience was I left with a degree in one hand, and I left with unanswered questions about how to address social equity in the other. And so I say that to offer context because for the past 13 or so years, I've really been walking a path that Alan Altshuler of Harvard University's Graduate School of Design described in the following manner. He once said that no planner will be able to consider his education complete who's not grappled with the dilemmas that Norman Krumholtz faced. And he made that statement in the preface of a book entitled Making Equity Planning Work. And actually, just this past year, I had the opportunity to work on a planning advisory service memo for the American Planning Association that went out to roughly 40,000 members, in which we were trying to really contextualize and explain more effectively why addressing these particular issues should be a priority for the nation's planners. So normally when I offer remarks on this topic, I tend to begin by simply stating that history is prologue. Now, I'm not going to overwhelm you with a lot of history on this evening. However, the soundbite message is when we understand history in the context of city and regional planning, we can encourage better public policy and avoid repeating the same mistakes. One point that I do need to stress is the International City-County Management Association tends to emphasize that planning at its best takes into account the social implications of land use and economic development decisions. What this means is planning is not professionally or institutionally separate from the social realm. In practical terms, it means we are a nation of 324 million people. We have citizens from all walks of life, and if we don't think critically about how to meet the needs of vulnerable populations properly, then we may fall short in ensuring that everyone has a safe and healthy environment in which to live, work, and play. The points made by ICMA have been made by other groups. For example, in December 1996, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council submitted a report to EPA entitled The Search for Authentic Signs of Hope. Not only did the report identify the environmental benefits of urban redevelopment, the report also emphasized that the best outcomes would only come about through an inclusive process. In hindsight, this study could be viewed as EPA's first study on sustainable communities. And it's also worth noting that this report is a very good indicator of just how forward-thinking environmental justice proponents have been over the years concerning their perspectives and views about the built environment. Now, the points of ICMA and the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council aren't isolated incidents. Actually, addressing the social implications of land use and economic development decisions has been a reoccurring theme in planning practice over the span of the past 50 years. So this isn't a new conversation, although the issue of equity is gaining prominence. This conversation actually goes as far back as 1965 in some respect. So we have the ability to look to the work of Paul Davidoff in advocacy planning, or Norman Krumholtz and approaches focusing on equity planning. Or even the work of Dr. Shannon, former professor here at the University of Washington. Sharon Sutton, thank you very much, in terms of their work. And the reason why I mention them, and there's so many other persons whom I can mention, whom I can't name at this time, is the fact that they were trailblazers, individuals who really understood that a period of focusing on equity wasn't going to pass, and instead, as allied professionals, our need to focus on issues of this nature could really become the new normal. And so, because of their work, because of their scholarship, we now have 50 years of institutional knowledge to build on. And of course, the approach that's gained traction in recent years is equitable development. And PolicyLink has been the main proponent of the approach. PolicyLink is based in Oakland, California. I really tip my hat to PolicyLink, given all the work that they've done over the span of the past 19 years in terms of sustaining a public conversation on issues of equitable development. It's worth noting that they actually had their 6th Equity Summit. It was held in Chicago in April, and the event actually drew roughly 4,000 attendees. And just in case you missed it, I just want to state that 2015 was a very impressive year. There were many who had important points to make about social equity in the context of planning, including Pope Francis. Thank God for Pope Francis. So this slide just really offers a quick listing and just shares just the number of different groups who actually had conferences or workshops or important statements to offer pertaining to the issue of equity around 2015. Far too many to fit on one slide, but it's a clear sign of pent-up demand. And perhaps what this actually tells us is the fact that many groups understand that perhaps what we've been doing for so long is no longer good enough, and we now need to find our true north. The previous endeavors are reminders that the objectives of urban redevelopment and meeting the needs of underserved communities are not mutually exclusive. We can address both, and when we do, the outcome is equitable development. Okay, that's a little bit better. As you can see by the diagram, there is an area of overlap, and this space will be the focus of our discussion for this evening. If you've ever read the book, Getting to Yes, by a show of hands, how many of you read that book? You may recall the advice to avoid splitting the pie into more pieces. Instead, the goal should be to increase or enlarge the size of the pie. And so with regards to equitable development, what we're going to talk about this evening is how communities around the country are actually expanding the size of the pie by focusing on strategies in order to advance goals of parity as communities are rebuilt. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I simply want to acknowledge the fact that the approaches for encouraging sustainable communities are expansive. They are not restrictive. The principles that are referenced on this slide were prepared while working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. They were my way as a practitioner in order to make sense of some things that I was dealing with and experiencing while working within the agency on urban policy. And also what they represented was really a way in order to clearly understand the fact that advancing goals of equity is the sum of its parts. Sometimes when we talk about issues of equity, it seems rather abstract, or either when we talk about equity, we think we're only talking about affordable housing, when the reality is that there are a number of things which persons are particularly sensitive about that need to be addressed if we're going to advance goals of community parity. Recently, I was invited to offer remarks at the College of Design at North Carolina State University. And during that particular presentation, I offered a confession about my time in graduate school as well as my experience working on urban planning within the public sector. And in both instances, I was periodically puzzled by the fact that something seemed missing from the conversation. I couldn't quite put my finger on what was troubling me at the time, nor was I able to put it into words, but my training as a sociologist wasn't going to let me rest. As stewards of the built environment, it's fair to say that we often focus on or we try to shape the things that we see. I think that's a fair assessment to make. But one of the things I just want to stress is the fact that sometimes when we are so preoccupied about developing planning policy in a value-neutral manner, that we sometimes don't give issues that are below the surface the proper attention that they deserve. And when that occurs, although that particular approach to developing public policy may work for some, it may alleviate vulnerability for some, it may in fact amplify vulnerability for others. And so that's the abbreviated story for how these principles for equitable development were prepared. Again, really to stress that equity is the sum of its parts, also to draw attention to solutions that have been left in the shadows, and third, really to amplify and to stress the fact that these issues are within our purview as practitioners. It's no accident that our profession is called planning. It's not called accident. So we have a responsibility as practitioners in order to anticipate, to adapt, and to understand that there are new opportunities and challenges that we need to be prepared to respond to. So we don't have to have an abstract discussion about equitable development on this evening. There are actually plenty of tangible examples that demonstrate the application of the approach. For example, in Oakland, California, the Unity Council never gave up its vision for improving the Fruitvale district, even though it took longer than a decade to bring it into fruition. What's interesting about this particular case example is the fact that it really demonstrates the importance of respecting local knowledge and also the importance of really confronting situations if you're a citizen who is living in a community and you feel that certain decisions have been made in a manner that's not particularly respectful of your needs. One of the things that's worth noting about this project is Bay Area Rapid Transit proposed planning building a 5-story parking garage within the Fruitvale district without consulting with the residents in the 1990s. And actually, when they made that decision, they didn't anticipate receiving pushback from local residents, nor did they consider finding an organized community voice prompted by the intervention of the Unity Council. Now, one of the things that's worth noting in particular about this project was the fact that as the Unity Council, BART, and residents had the opportunity to work together, they eventually realized that residents particularly didn't have a problem with the proposition of building a parking garage. Instead, they simply felt the garage was going to be positioned in the wrong location in terms of the district, and positioned in a manner in which it wouldn't really help to bring the community together. Instead, it would actually segment the community and actually disrupt the sense of community within the district. And so eventually, through a process of design charrettes, they realized that a more innovative solution would be to connect the transit station to the district's main shopping strip on International Boulevard by putting in place a pedestrian walkway or plaza. And so it took another 10 years, an investment of $100 million, and the formation of a new partnership, but eventually it resulted in the Fruitvale Transit Village, which we all know is a transit-oriented development project in Oakland, California. It's built around a rapid transit station and a bus hub. And one of the things that I should point out is that BART did get the opportunity to build that 5-story parking garage that it wanted to build, but is now positioned in a manner so that it doesn't cut the community off. Instead, it's now part of a much more larger, more sophisticated community development project that includes shops, a health center, a child care center, as well as a computer technology job training center. And so again, the Fruitvale Transit Village project is an interesting example because what it shows is how responsible parties didn't limit themselves and they didn't avoid or subscribe, let me say. They didn't subscribe to an approach of conflict avoidance. Instead, they realized they had a shared problem, and they needed to work through it, and they needed to communicate with one another and air a lot of things out so that they could actually develop a more innovative solution that would work for the parties that were involved. Another interesting example is actually the Bayview project along the eastern shore of Virginia. I had a video that I was going to show, but I won't be able to do so this evening. But this is a project that actually goes back to 1997 when Bayview Citizens for Social Justice applied for an environmental justice small grant from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. When they submitted the application to EPA, one of the things that we really didn't anticipate was that the conditions within Bayview were a lot more distressing than one would have imagined based on reviewing the grant proposal. At the time of the submission of the grant proposal, roughly 90% of the housing stock in Bayview was substandard housing. Substandard housing in this instance meant tar paper shacks. 85% of the housing within Bayview didn't have running water. And also it's worth noting that the community didn't have the infrastructure in place in order to handle stormwater runoff. So Bayview really needed a design solution. This was 1997, but they were living in conditions that were more akin to 1897. And so eventually Bayview Citizens for Social Justice was able to identify an architect, and he worked with the residents of that community through a community-driven planning process, and they were able to focus on ways in order to develop new strategies to build housing, to focus on the infrastructure problem for the stormwater runoff, also to focus on the building of public spaces, public gathering spaces for the residents within that community. And so it was a 6-year, $10 million effort that actually resulted in a number of innovative results and outcomes for the residents who were living within that community. But it had a cascading effect as well that's particularly interesting. The Bayview project is actually one of the earliest examples of public interest design. And public interest design is a very popular approach towards planning among architects. And so some of you may know the gentleman at the lower end of the screen. His name is Maurice Cox. It was his design firm that worked on the planning solutions for the Bayview project. And of course, Maurice is currently the planning director for the city of Detroit. Another interesting example to reference comes from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Of course, we live in an era where we often find grocery stores within urban settings, but it wasn't long ago when many cities were often dealing with the problem of not having adequate services in terms of proper grocery store facilities. So in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they realized they needed to make some very important choices. And it was a choice between either supplying communities with the proper services that they needed in order to address issues of nutrition and prevention and health, or either subscribing to the status quo, whereby underserved communities, untapped markets, simply do the best with what they have. Dwight Evans, who was a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives at the time, realized that latter scenario wasn't sustainable. And because of his leadership, he was actually able to convince a partnership to form that included private interests as well as 3 nonprofit organizations. And that led to the creation of the Fresh Food Financing Initiative. One of the things that's worth noting about that particular initiative is that the Food Trust, which was one of the partners in the Fresh Food Financing Initiative, based on their research, they realized that low-income communities within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania actually had a higher amount of buying power that was largely untapped. And so through the work of creating or making an investment of $10 million, the state of Pennsylvania did, this was an investment that actually almost paid for itself within 2 years. 2 years later, they had an $80 million fund in order to support building grocery stores in places in urban and rural communities throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so this particular program is important because of the fact that it obviously supports the creation of jobs, the resiliency of local economies, supporting and strengthening the tax base as well. And this is a project that Dwight Evans is very passionate about. He's very proud of it. And Dwight Evans currently serves in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, I don't want to be so swift in my remarks and presume that everyone is having an aha moment right now, or a moment of clarity, or an epiphany, if you will. A clear question that may be on the minds of some is, why encourage equitable development? And that's a good question, and I'm going to give you 3 good reasons. First, equitable development is profitable. Over the span of 37 years of business, Shore Bank amassed roughly $2.6 billion in assets by investing in people and their communities to create economic equity in a healthy environment. They were founded in 1973. during a period when banks routinely denied loans to underserved communities through the process of redlining. However, the founders of Shore Bank reasoned that setting up roadblocks for accessing capital really wasn't an astute strategy for combating the problems of urban disinvestment and blight. And so if you consider the legacy of 50 years of disinvesting in America's cities, then you may conclude that the founders of the former Shore Bank Corporation were right for going against the grain and being pioneers in community development banking. Second, I just want to acknowledge that social responsibility versus economic imperative is a false choice. We can address both. And as suggested by this photograph, our problems don't go away by ignoring them. Over the span of time that I've been working on environmental policy issues, I can recall moments when some environmental groups questioned whether emerging issues like environmental justice were legitimate. And today, I believe proponents for place-based initiatives are faced with a similar choice. We can either take the position that issues like equitable development are not legitimate, and that is one option available to us, or we can take the position of the Center for American Progress and acknowledge the fact that poverty imposes an enormous cost on society. And for this reason, it's important that our approaches towards planning development actually work towards leveling the playing field rather than amplifying the wealth gap. And then finally, I really just want to stress that it is a matter of ethics. In recent years, I think the best moral argument about sustainability has been made by Robin Collins of Willamette University in Oregon. She once said that in the context of talking about sustainability, that we shouldn't dig a hole and then put the future of our children in it. I respect the point that's been made by Professor Collins, but I think there's a nuance to her message that we shouldn't overlook. And that is the fact that we shouldn't dig a hole and then put the future of someone else in it. And so when planning and development decisions are made in a manner in which we don't really take into consideration impacts that may affect underserved populations and vulnerable groups, we're actually putting someone else's future in a hole. Actually, I respect the Center for Disease Control in this particular context because of all the federal agencies that have place-based programs. The CDC was the first to actually acknowledge that there are social impacts connected to gentrification. And the CDC realized that there is an inconvenient truth. There is a problem. There is an elephant in the room that we really need to address and try to be responsive towards. And so in their efforts, in their initiative, they didn't want to put someone else's future in a hole. And it was the responsible thing to do. This is actually the reason why at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, we actually have a statement concerning gentrification as well on our website that targets the issue of equitable development. Last year, I was working on a project for the American Planning Association, and in the process of writing and trying to complete it, it occurred to me that gentrification as an issue has a lot in common with manufacturing, in the sense that both issues tend to produce their own set of externalities. And sometimes the public can be rather insensitive about externalities. You know, when externalities are positive, there can be a general sense of apathy. But when externalities are negative, there can be a real sense of frustration for the persons who are bearing the burden of those particular externalities. And so really, the point that is the bottom line here is that how we respond to other people's suffering has always been at the center of the public debate about gentrification. We do need to improve communities. I don't question that point. I'm not here to question that point. No one is questioning that. But the means to getting there is just as important as the end. And the other thing that I really want to stress is simply the fact that when we fail to anticipate, understand, and mitigate impacts from market opportunities or market actions, we create blind spots. And if we learned anything from the subprime lending crisis or from the current impacts of climate change, and yes, I'm an EPA employee and climate change is real. if we have learned anything about blind spots are more severe when they're scaled up. And so that's the reason why it's important that we understand and think more critically about how do we mitigate impacts that are common with the activities that occur as we help to improve communities. So as I transition, I want to take time really to acknowledge that the projects that I introduced earlier aren't the exception. We simply need to invest more time in understanding what makes them work. Traditionally, when we focus on advancing goals of social equity in the process of planning, the main barriers have been really framing how to implement it during the planning process, visualizing the product from that process, and then correcting the misperception that it doesn't slow down development. However, thanks to the tireless efforts of researchers and advocates, the creative thinking of planners and architects, and the compelling results of determined community builders, those barriers are coming down. As a planner, I tend to believe that the most interesting and inspiring work tends to be in the places where we spend the least amount of time. And what I've learned is that if we're going to win the future by being innovative, we're going to have to move beyond intellectual environments where some ideas are viewed as brilliant and other ideas are casually dismissed as being wishful thinking. And so with that, I want to just go into these 3 projects and share them with you because I think they really say a lot about the merits of equitable development as an approach. And the other thing about them is I think it's important to talk about them because they demonstrate what can happen when we rise above false choices. So for the first example, I'm going to take you to Kansas City, Missouri. That's a nice plaque. And the reason why I'm making that comment is because in far too many communities around the country, when you visit them, they often have a plaque that basically summarizes or states what used to be there. And I think that's a very low bar. And fortunately, in Kansas City, Missouri, citizens understood that they could do a lot more than just simply erect a marker to their special places. And so just to give you a little bit more context, at the turn of the 20th century, the 18th and Vine neighborhood was the heart of the African American community in Kansas City, Missouri. At that time, there were churches, businesses, entertainment venues, recreational facilities, and of course the city's reputation for jazz was elevated by local artisans like Count Basie and Charlie Parker. But of course, Kansas City, like so many inner city areas, experienced a period of decline over the span of about 40 years. But it wasn't until a new generation of citizens in Kansas City took a renewed interest in jazz that this neighborhood was given an opportunity to make a comeback. It was Emmanuel Cleaver, as a council member, who understood that this community had a place making dividend. He spearheaded the creation of the Jazz District with the vision of balancing economic development and cultural development. And so today, Kansas City has distinguished itself as one of the few cities nationally that has attempted to create a sense of parity in this manner. The 18th and Vine Jazz District is now a $70 million success story. It's worth noting that in terms of the Jazz District, when in 1997, the main assets within that district included the American Jazz Museum as well as the Negro League Baseball Museum. But in recent years, there's been an increase in apartments, townhomes, and lofts, and several hundred residents have now relocated to this part of the city. But the important thing to note is really the fact that the Jazz District is now a place that is celebrated as being one of the iconic places of the city. And it wouldn't have happened if residents simply took the perspective of just not investing the time and effort, the grassroots effort, in order to actually turn this place around and to make sure that they preserve places that were important towards their sense of identity. Interesting work is also occurring in National City, California. National City is a community that really demonstrates quite effectively that residents and intermediaries can work together in order to reverse the problems of outdated land uses and policies that may be injurious towards their residents. In National City, they had a trend of having industrial land uses in the Old Town area of the city, And eventually what that led to was the problem of persons' health being compromised and a lot of other challenges that eventually affected property values within that neighborhood. Eventually, the Environmental Health Coalition, which is an intermediary that's located in National City, California, worked with residents so that they could start thinking about how they could more critically and more proactively use planning as a means in order to reverse the conditions that they were dealing with. They did a number of different things, including passing an amortization ordinance in order to phase out incompatible land uses. They developed a Westside specific plan in order to articulate their vision more critically in terms of building new housing as well as preserving Paradise Creek. The other thing that residents in National City understood was the fact that they wanted to make sure that they added environmental justice provisions to their general plan for the city. In California, general plans are the same as comprehensive plans. And so State Senator Connie Leyva was always sensitive to the work that National City was doing. She thought that that recommendation or that idea was great. And so she actually took the initiative to author a bill that became a law in 2016. Now all jurisdictions, cities and counties in California need to include an environmental justice element in their general plan. And so the efforts that have undergone in National City really demonstrate that great communities don't happen by accident. It requires an investment of planning, energy, investment, as well as good attention on the behalf of not just municipal governments, but the citizens who live there as well. And in terms of one last example, I want to draw your attention to South Carolina, where a gentleman by the name of Harold Mitchell has been really an effective leader in advancing change in the city of Spartanburg. The Arkwright and Forest Park communities are roughly 2 miles from downtown Spartanburg. This story actually starts a little tragic because of the fact that those two neighborhoods were overburdened by incompatible land uses. They actually had 2 Superfund sites. One was a former fertilizer plant, the other was a solid waste landfill. And so this was because of the fact that they didn't have a lot of zoning regulations in terms of that section of the city in the 1970s. By the 1990s, Harold began to understand that there were some real connections between the pollution and the health impacts that residents within Arkwright and Forest Park were experiencing. So Harold got busy very quickly. He took the initiative to organize residents, to conduct community meetings, to do research on the abandoned and contaminated sites. And he also took the initiative to build a partnership amongst a number of different stakeholders. He was able to leverage the support of the Environmental Protection Agency in Atlanta. Now, because of his collaborative approach, he eventually was able to build a partnership that included the city, the county, the local housing authority, the regional office of the EPA in Atlanta, as well as the University of South Carolina upstate. One of the things that Harold took the initiative to do when he was able to build and bring all these stakeholders together was he created an organization called ReGenesis. And the mission of ReGenesis was twofold. First, to clean up the dirtier sites that were within the community that obviously were a disproportionate burden on the residents who lived there. And the second goal was to make sure that they framed the vision for how to redevelop those two communities so that residents could enjoy the benefits that persons were enjoying in other parts of Spartanburg. And so the long story, making it short, is the fact that Harold has been very effective in taking what was a $20,000 grant from EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and leveraging it into $300 million worth of reinvestment for his community. It's also worth noting that this project actually received an award from the American Planning Association in 2015, a National Planning Excellence Award. And also Harold was able to expand his role as a community advocate while serving in the South Carolina legislature. Now, there's a lot that I can say about great projects, but there is a serious takeaway that I want to leave you with, and that's really the importance of paying it forward. When I talked about Spartanburg, I simply acknowledged really a lot of the benefits that have been occurring based on the partnership of the ReGenesis project. But it's important to note that Arkwright and Forest Park were in some pretty dangerous conditions in the mid-1990s, in the sense that both neighborhoods were isolated physically from Spartanburg. It's also worth noting that there was high unemployment, and there was also criminal activity that was going on. Fortunately, they were able to reverse these conditions over time. But I was in Spartanburg on August 26, 2014. This was one day after the civil unrest ended in Ferguson, Missouri on August 25. And so the reason why I'm sharing this anecdote with you is because on August 26 in Spartanburg, they were having a celebration that focused on 16 years of making deliberate investments in equitable development. It's unfortunate that in Ferguson, Missouri, they weren't able to have the same type of celebration. And so I'm stating this because there are times when skeptics may make issues appear to be more complex than they actually are, when it really isn't that deep. It's actually better to make the investments up front in the places where they need to be made for the people who really need them, rather than try to correct the problems after they spiral out of control. And so another question that you may have is really, what does all of this really have to do with public policy? And I think it would be careless if I didn't take a moment to explain that, and I'm going to respond by simply using a literary metaphor from the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And what I want to do is simply state, what does this really have to do with whitewashing a fence? I've worked on urban policy at the federal level, and it's been my experience that the manner for handling issues which fall along the social pillar of sustainability often leaves a lot to be desired. And one of the things that I had to learn how to do while working at the EPA is I had to learn how to whitewash a fence. In summary, I made working on these issues appear to be as fun and fascinating as the prevailing approaches for encouraging sustainable communities. And you would be amazed just how quickly a program will warm up to an idea like equitable development once you establish a track record from lecturing and writing, by coordinating recognition programs, by making it a requirement of the grants and cooperative agreements that you manage, by building relationships with allied professionals, and by conducting community technical assistance projects. At the end of the day, public policy is about priorities and values, not just rules. And sometimes the best way to encourage an institution to be pliable is to simply change the way in which we manage the projects which fall under our portfolio. So as I wrap up, the 3 points that I want to make. First is the fact that award-winning outcomes for equitable development are not the result of serendipity. Instead, they're the result of clearly set expectations, collaborative problem solving, and persistent leadership. Second, I really want to emphasize that if we're going to encourage more healthier, more prosperous communities, we're going to have to penetrate new audiences. And there's a lot of untapped talent that we need to leverage as we strive to improve the environments where we live, work, and play. And the third point that I just want to make is the fact, and I think I've been making this message throughout my presentation, is the fact that you cannot encourage a truly sustainable community without addressing social equity. Any attempt to do so would be like cherry picking. And cherry picking doesn't solve difficult problems. Instead, it simply shifts the burden of responsibility to another generation. And so if you're interested in learning more on this topic, here are some resources that will enable you to remain engaged. I just want to, of course, again, acknowledge that PolicyLink in Oakland, California has been working on equitable development for roughly about 19 years, and there are plenty of resources on their website that would be of use to you. I just want to stress that within the span of the past 25 years, EPA's Office of Environmental Justice has developed a number of different tools for articulating and contextualizing our experience in terms of doing place-based work. The ReGenesis project that I mentioned earlier was actually the subject of a collaborative problem-solving model. We prepared a report to synthesize the lessons from that experience. We published a model so that the public can understand exactly, one, what were the outcomes in Spartanburg, but two, what were the steps that they actually went through in a collaborative manner in order to achieve better outcomes. We also have a website that focuses on the intersections between environmental justice and equitable development. Through my presentation, although I have made reference to environmental justice on occasion, it has not been my intention to conflate the two issues. Instead, what I have been attempting to do is to demonstrate that they're both complementary to one another and that there's a great degree of overlap between the two. And then, of course, also, there are a number of different conferences that occur around the country that may be of interest to you, where you can meet and engage and work with persons who do have an interest in these particular topics or issues that may be complementary to them. One of which is the National Organization of Minority Architects Conference. The next one will actually be held in Chicago in October. And so I just want to state that having a portfolio on equitable development actually makes sense within the Office of Environmental Justice. It's actually something we had to grow into over time. One of the things that's interesting is the fact that the portfolio, in one form or another, has always been there. We just didn't have a proper term for framing what in fact was an expanding body of place-based work. But we have awarded grants to projects that are now seen as models for equitable development. We've organized national workshops on the topic for roughly about 5 years. We currently have a webinar series on this issue that we've been offering for the past 2.5 years. And so we saw an opportunity. We also saw a gap. We responded. We understood the trend. And this has given us an opportunity to work with new groups, to work with new partners, to expand how we provide services to the public. And so I just want to conclude tonight's lecture really with an equity challenge as well as with a personal story. As I stated at the beginning of my remarks, I came to Seattle, Washington, and I spent a summer here interning and working with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 1994. At that time, I was a sociology social work major, and one of the first projects I was asked to work on for the EPA was actually assisting a toxicologist to identify a coordinator for a seafood consumption survey that took into account or consideration cultural dietary habits. I'm a social work major. Do I know anything about toxicology? No. Do I know anything about seafood consumption surveys? Of course not. Did I know anything about the distinctions in cultural dietary habits in the Pacific Northwest? Not at all. But I jumped into the project with both feet because I had an interest in really learning about environmental justice as an issue and really just expanding my sense of understanding of why these issues were important. I felt the exposure would do me some good. And so I really want to leave you just with the following encouraging points of simply being bold, being curious, and being mindful. Because the public is relying on us collectively, as planners, as architects, as urban designers, to move beyond our comfort zones. And so with that, I want to thank you for indulging me. Again, I want to thank the College of Built Environments for inviting me. And I am happy to address any questions that you may have at this time.